Hello students, welcome back to my class. Today we are going to study Elaine Showalter's essay 20 Years On, a Literature of Their Own Revisited. This essay was published in 1998, almost 20 years after her book, A Literature of Their Own. As we know, Showalter is an American literary critic, a feminist literary historian, and writer of cultural and social issues. She is better known for her woman-centric approach to literary analysis, known better as gynocriticism. So in this essay, she wants to revisit her own book that she wrote at the beginning of the period when feminist literary criticism was not in a very comprehensible shape. So in that book, as we know, she has traced the tradition of women's literature in England by examining the works and lives of women novelists from 1840 to the contemporary time of her writing. Her analysis includes both great and minor novelists, their lives and work. And in that book, she discusses the female literary tradition that she finds has evolved through three phases: imitation and internalizing the artistic and social values in the first phase, the protest and call for autonomy and self-discovery, and that is in the second phase, and in the third phase, the turning inward in search for identity on the part of the women writers. And there she views these three phases in women literary tradition as feminine, which is from 1840 to 1880. And during that period, as already she has told, that this is an imitating period, internalizing the artistic and social values. So we can look at the example of George Eliot taking a male pseudonym. And the second phase, it was the feminist phase, which spans from 1880 to 1920, according to her, where the women's suffrage winning voting rights. And the third phase, that is the female phase, from 1920 to 1960, the phase of self-awareness and searching for or creating their own identity. So, in spite of sharing the solidarity from the beginning, she finds that the women from the beginning, particularly the women writers, never expressed any communality, a sense of communality or self-awareness till 1840. Even during the feminine period that begins from 1840 to continues to 1880, there was no definite expression of female experience, bearing few innovative and covert ways of expressing their inner life. From Jane Austen to George Eliot, the women novelists depicted daily life and values of women within the confinement of the family and the community. In the feminist phase, the women writers questioned the stereotypes and challenged the restrictions of women's language and denounced the ethics of self-sacrifice, so on and so forth, to press for socio-political changes. And during this time, as we know, there was the agitation for equal wages or working hours and the electoral rights and all these things. And this period particularly saw the emergence of female tradition and challenged it challenged the patriarchal establishments. And then the third period, that is identified by her as the female phase, exhibited courageous self-exploration and a return to more realistic mode of expression. And post 1960, there was the expression of anger and sexuality in a more authentic and creative manner. So, in this way, she is identifying the first wave of feminist movement, which is named, given the nomenclature of female period, it is a political period. That is 18th century and 19th century. And the second wave of feminist movement is identified as academic period during the 1960s and 1970s. And the third wave of this feminist movement is a cultural period. The first wave brought suffrage groups to demand political and economical equality and the rights of inheritance, where we find Virginia Woolf writing that most significant and most referred book, A Room of One's Own, that debated about women independence and gendered language. And during the second wave, it is marked by the critique of patriarchy in constructing cultural identity of women. When we see another great feminist writer, Simone de Beauvoir, writing the book The Second Sex, which discusses about othering of women and the transcending of the binary gendered space. The third wave, that is post 1980, the feminism got actively involved in academics, Marxism, psychoanalysis, post-structuralism, and engaged with language, sexuality, representation, so on and so forth. So in this way, Showalter posits the dualities of feminist criticism into feminist critique. And she differentiates between woman as reader, that is belonging to feminist criticism, and gynocriticism, where the woman as writer. And in the first category, she brings the woman as the consumers of male-produced literature, where feminist criticism is concerned with the stereotypical representation of women, the fissures in male-oriented literary theory, and manipulation of female audience by patriarchy. But on the other hand, gynocriticism has attempted to construct a female framework for analysis of women's literature and focus on female subjectivity, language, and literary career. It is a criticism of gynotexts by women who are not passive consumers but active producers of meaning. So, all these things, they were presented by Showalter in her book, the phenomenal book that is known as A Literature of Their Own. So, coming to this present essay, we have to see that how she evaluates her creation of that particular book. So, she is telling that the purpose of writing this book, behind this book, there were several purposes at that time. She is recounting all these things in this particular essay, and she is telling that when she was undertaking her PhD work during 1965, she realized that there is an absence of feminist criticism. And by 1970, when she had completed her PhD, she got involved as an active member of the women's liberation movement at that moment. And she was also writing for radical feminism. And The other things that spurred her or inspired her for writing this book was that she found during her search that there was a phenomenal gap between the writings of Jane Austen and Doris Lessing between 18th century and 20th century. In the evolution of women novel writers, there was not any work being done during this period. And number 5, she is recounting that the belief that she had believed strongly at that time when she was undertaking the writing of this book, that she will get an audience for her book, because that was the condition of women writers, that they were uncertain about their audience and their publishers even during the 70s. So these are the purposes behind her writing of that book. She is recounting in this novel, and she is also telling that if there was a female literary tradition, I was sure it came from imitation, literary convention, the marketplace and critical reception, not from biology or psychology. And my theoretical assumptions came from sociology and ethnography of literature. So she is recounting that how she had undergone all these mental conditions and thoughts before writing that book. So what were her assumptions? Her assumptions, as already I have told, that it came from the sociology and ethnography of literature. And she thought that initially when women started writing, the woman writing was mostly imitative. And she has thought about the woman writing as a subculture. Because she is telling in this particular essay, I quote, I attempted to define women's writing as a product of a subculture evolving with relation to a dominant mainstream. In its evolution, I argued women's writing moves in the direction of an all-inclusive female realism, a broad, socially informed exploration of the daily lives and values of women within the family and the community. So in this way, she is telling that women's writing, it started with the imitative purpose, and initially it was not able to compete with the male writers, so it evolved as a subculture, because it tried to bring out something already within the society, being a part of the society, what women feel about the same daily realities, daily experiences. And further she is telling that I didn't know how to answer about the autonomy of a woman's literary tradition, but I felt sure that there would be an audience for my book. The female tradition in the English novel, to a literature of their own, a phrase. This phrase became the title of her book that she wrote at that time, which was published in 1977. But she is telling that the original title of the book, as she had thought, that was the female tradition in the English novel. But the publisher changed it to a literature of their own, a phrase they took from the statement by John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill, the 19th century writer who wrote the book The Subjection of Women, from that book this particular phrase was taken. So here in this essay, she is trying to justify the title of her essay, of her book. Why? Because thereafter she is narrating in this essay that how her book was received during her period by the contemporary female literary critics and writers. So she is telling that the book was interpreted and the title was interpreted by many contemporary women writers, and particularly Toril Moy, as a reference to Virginia Woolf's phenomenal book, A Room of One's Own. So she is telling that though the title of her book was taken from a phrase in John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Woman, but most of the contemporary female writers or critics, they thought that it is in reference to Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, where Virginia Woolf argued for the private space or the personal space of the woman and evolution of a new language for women. So in this way, she is telling that her book was not received in its true spirit. Rather, there were so many misinterpretations of the book, and the book got very adverse comments about its writing. But she is telling that the male critics like K.K. Ruthven, they emphasized that this book was a progressive book, and the women writers and critics must and do habitually read the work of men, but until very recently the reverse has not been the case. So she is writing here in this essay, the critical reception of a literature of their own by men has been generally respectful, but among women critics the book has been both imitated and reviled. So she is expressing her frustration, disappointment with the fellow women critics or writers. So what were the criticisms? So number one, that it is misinterpretation of the title as reference to Virginia Woolf's A Room of Their Own by Thoril Moy. Thoril Moy accused her of having hidden motives of appropriation and rejection. The second is, Showalter indicates her problematic distance from the tradition of women writers. That Elaine Showalter is trying to make a distance from the tradition of women writers. The third criticism is that the theoretical framework is never made explicit. That means it is like a bourgeois realism or critical realism, but it is not the exact social realism that she is presenting in her book. The fourth criticism about her book was that it was dependent on traditional aesthetic categories and its inability to appreciate the decentered writing of modernism and its feminist issues. That she has not been able to appreciate the modernism and feminist issues properly in her book. The fifth criticism in her book, as pointed out by her here, is that it has unstated theoretical assumptions about relationship between literature and reality and between feminist politics and literary evolution. The sixth criticism that emerged from the reception of her book is aimed to create a separate canon of women's writing, not to abolish all canons. And another one, that is the seventh one, is that the book is too dismissive of the artistic importance of women novelists of 1890s or underestimated the value of other women's suffrage novel like M.J. Ezel and Thoril Moy, etc. So these are the criticisms about her book. Therefore, the book got very terrible response from the fellow women writers and all that. And then she is writing in this essay, when she is making an evaluation of all these 20 years of publication of the book and how it has been received. So she is telling, for the past 20 years, I have been attacked from virtually every point on the feminist hermeneutics circle as a separatist, careerist, theoretical, anti-theoretical, racist, homophobic, politically correct, traditional and non-canonical critic. So these are the accusations against me, and I have to come to expect new critical studies of women's writing to point out how I have failed. So, as if everyone is pointing the finger towards her, that she has failed to deliver for feminist criticism or female writing. But she is telling that when I started writing, at that time there was no any concrete shape of feminist criticism, and whatever writing was there, like Virginia Woolf and other things, and other writers, they were just having the scattered ideas, but there was no comprehensive idea about women literature and how to appreciate it. But she is telling that I have had the advantages of 2 decades of a fruitful and dazzling critical revolution in women's literary history and feminist criticism to broaden my understanding, deepen my knowledge, and sharpen my thinking. But she is telling during these 2 decades, the reception of her book has created so many ripples, so many actions and reactions by which the women's literary history and feminist criticism, it has broadened, and it has broadened her understanding of it, because she has to go through all these criticism and she has to further study and further analyze the things, and it had broadened her knowledge. So she is telling that now what is her understanding of the women's literature, as she is telling that in the first phase it was mostly imitative. She is also telling that for women's writing is always at least bitextual, because female literary lineage is partly rhetorical and it is following the male tradition, as well as it was trying to bring in the woman's existence or experiences within it. And she is further telling that coming to the theory of female literary history, the beginning of the female literary theory or the history is a dialogue between women writers and a patriarchal tradition. It is a dialogue, means women writing is a dialogue between women writers and patriarchal tradition. So she is telling that that was the idea at the initial stage. But now in the 1990s that she is making a review of these things. So what is her realization? She realizes that in 1990s criticism of women's writing has to take the fullest possible account of the whole network of literary forces in which each text is enmeshed, and my hypothetical model of a chain of female literary influences needs to be understood as a historically specific strategy rather than a dogmatic absolute. So she is telling that what she did in her book was to bring the whole tradition or the history of women writing in a chain process as an evolution from the beginning towards the growing stage, instead of looking at it from a very dispersed, very distributive point of view. And then she is telling, then what are the arguments she was trying to present in her book. So she is trying to say that she wanted to focus on the rediscovery of female tradition of writing. And secondly, she wanted to focus on the importance of writing about continuities between generations of women writers. So she is telling that Toril Moi, who was so critical about her work, she argued that my theoretical framework is never made explicit. In her view, my implicit theory was that a text should reflect the writer's experience, and that the more authentic the experience is felt to be by the reader, the more valuable the text. So, in this way, Toril Moi accused her that she is producing bourgeois realism instead of the social realism. And she wanted to see that bourgeois realism in the work of the women writers. And then she is telling that Moi's analysis of feminist criticism have been very influential. Therefore, everyone went with Moi's analysis of my book. But as a literary historian, I would still have found little that was useful in their work, means in the work of Helena Sikos, Irigaray and Julia Kristeva, etc. So she is telling that Moi missed the real theoretical assumption of a literature of their own assumptions derived from a very different approach to literature, reality, gender, so on and so forth. Because the most important theoretical questions, according to her, were philosophical. But whereas the ideas of Showalter regarding this question was historical and cultural. That is the difference. Moi was approaching the female literary tradition or female literature from the philosophical point of view. But Elaine Showalter is approaching them from the historical and cultural point of view. That is one of the most important difference between their approach. And secondly, she is telling that when she offered the concept of gynocriticism, it developed to offer a coherent narrative of women's literary history. In relation to the literary mainstream, women's writing has moved through phases of subordination, protest and autonomy. Already we have discussed that how the three phases, subordination, protest and autonomy phases, three phases were there in her argument in her book. And then she is also talking about that how Margaret J. Ezel blames the evolutionary model given by her in her book about women writing. But she is clarifying that the evolutionary model is the right model to make a proper or true assessment of the women's writing in a historical manner. So she is telling, in past phase, feminist criticism developed out of a dialogue with the Victorian patriarch. And Victorian studies was a field hospitable to the feminist presence early on in its interdisciplinarity and acceptance of women's writer. But Victorian period, because it was the only literary period in which women were accepted as canonical writers. By late 1970s, feminist criticism was debating differences of class and race, and my references to the development of black literary subculture as a precedent for feminist scholarship to use. So she is telling that these are the things that she finds between the argument of her contemporary writers, female writers or women writers, and her book. And Taril Moi again going for another accusation against her, that she was trying to create a separate canon of women's writing, not to abolish all canons. And she has answered by telling that canon formation involving the reclamation of devalued writers is an important part of critical revolutions, and that new canon will not surface except through the force of someone or some group's interest. That without having a focused interest, we cannot create a canonical concept. And for women's writing, we have to develop a canonical concept, because it is not conforming to the same canon that the patriarchal literature was having. And she is also answering again by telling that I was not advocating a simple Whig literary history, but I still remain committed to the idea, even the metaphor of progress in English women's writing, if only in terms of range and freedom of expression. So she was trying to just bring out the progress or the evolution in women's writing in terms of range and freedom of expression, that how gradually they have been able to express their sense of freedom and identity, creating an identity. Another accusation that already we have listed, that was, I was too dismissive of the artistic importance of women novelists of 1890s, or I had underestimated the value of women's suffrage novel. But she is answering that artistically and politically, the 1890s were a major period of women writers, in contrast to the gloom of Hardy and Gissing. Emmeline Pethick Lawrence, the British suffragist who was part of this generation, recalled the joy felt by the young women. And 1890s seemed to offer great opportunities to the young with the demise of the 3-volume novel and lending library system, and the rise of literary journal and the short story. So she is telling, no, I was only trying to record the evolution, that how the women writers of this period, they in the 1890s, they were able to do away with the 3-volume novel system, because lending library system was abolished, and the rise of literary journals and the short story came handy for these writers to express their day-to-day experiences. And she is also telling that by 1895, the blaze of women's writing was reduced to sparks and ashes, and the death of the new woman novel was widely proclaimed. And here we can recall that the writings of George Eliot. George Eliot wrote in her book Silly Novels that how this period saw emergence of a great number of women writers, but most of these writers, they were simply imitative. They were writing in one particular mode, a repetitive mode and a repetitive way of expressing their experiences. So she is writing here, women's novels in the 1890s often choose the woman artist, writer or intellectual as heroine and explore the limits of feminist aspiration for their generation. The tragic feminist intellectual is a 90s heroine as significant as the tragic mulatto in African American fiction. And she is telling that by 1900, by the turn of the century, the novel emerged as a problematic genre. And she is telling that the women writers could not negotiate the truth dilemmas of post-Victorian literature, not because of their lack of talent or their ideological single-mindedness, that they made inevitable their own exile from a canonical tradition that had begun to treat honesty as an issue that could only be resolved through aesthetic rarefaction. So she is telling that how the novels of 1990s to 2000, 1890s to 1900, how they differed from the earlier novels. That she is telling that the writers were not lacking talent or their ideological single-mindedness, but they were finding it in their writing experience, their exile from a canonical tradition. They wanted to separate themselves from the canonical tradition and create a new history of theirs. Therefore, she is telling the best British women's writings of the 1890s is the short story rather than the novel. And the new woman had to rewrite aestheticism and decadence in order to include female creativity. They had to present female sexuality and reproduction as positive creative forces rather than as biological traps or the binary opposite of artistic creation. So she is telling how gradually the female sexuality and reproduction has entered into the arena of novel writing as a positive creative force during this transition period. And she is further telling that the themes and forms of contemporary women's writing have certainly changed since 1970s. But now that she is making an evaluation after 20 years, she is telling that all these debates around her book, it has spurred, it has inspired new thoughts, new ways of writing, new ways of asserting on the part of the female identity. Therefore, new forms of contemporary women writing have certainly emerged. And she is telling the room of one's own becomes the destination, a feminine cessation from male power, logic and violence. It is a tomb. That she is telling that in her book Rather, she has warned that women should not isolate themselves in the metaphor of the room of one's own, because it will be a tomb. They should not secede themselves from male power, logic, and violence. In 1998, the room of one's own as the locus for chronic fatigue syndrome, female fantasy, or paralyzing anxiety is still an isolated space in women's fiction. But there is also hopeful evidence that contact with a female tradition and a female culture has been center, inspiring women writers to take strength and their independence to act in the world. So she is telling that why the women writers need a female culture or a female tradition, because that will inspire, that will provide the atmosphere for writing independently or expressing independently their ideas. And simply getting separated won't do. As in the different stages of feminist movement, the radical feminism cannot succeed. The metaphysical feminism will succeed because it cannot simply escape from the reality. It has to create a space of its own within the reality. And this space is not the physical space, but it is the space in the creativity. Therefore, she is telling that no longer seems meaningful and necessary feminist criticism and women's literary history do not depend on the discovery of a great unique genius, but on the establishment of the continuity and legitimacy of women's writing as a form of art. Therefore, she is coming to the conclusion that why we need a history or a feminist female culture or female tradition, feminist criticism, because feminist criticism and women's literary history, they do not depend on discovery of great unique genius. One single person cannot change it, but the establishment of the continuity and legitimacy of women's writing. So she is justifying her evolutionary theory of feminist criticism. The distinctions of nationality and culture I mean to imply in the title of a literature of their own are no longer as sharp as they were 25 years ago. But if the distinctions of gender may also soon become matters of literary history, it will be because feminist criticism has succeeded in its task, and having played a part in that great collective effort has been a source of pride and delight to me that no theoretical debate can ever blur. So she is taking pride in her achievement as the writer of that book by telling that this book has definitely made some progress on the part of female literary history or female writing. So in this way, in this essay, she makes an attempt to reassess the book she had written some 20 years ago, its reception, debates and controversies, and the impact it exerted on the evolution of women writing, both creative and critical. At first, she narrates her initiation into the writing of this book as a result of her research on Victorian women. She recounts how there was no feminist criticism as such except the writings of Virginia Woolf, which is more scattered or distributive over the period. And she is also talking about when published, it set the stage for the creative explosion and of the feminist literary studies. It initiated a major new area for literary investigation in the 80s by unearthing the long neglected tradition of women writers of England. So this is the essay. The essay is taking a complete assessment of the 20 years of publication of this book and the reception of this book. So from this, the question can be asked regarding that how Showalter makes a reassessment of her book and its impact on the contemporary feminist theories or feminist literary tradition. So already I have given you the points to write, or the questions can be asked for 5 marks or like that about what were the allegations against her. So I had given you the 7 points of allegations or criticism, and maybe question can be asked why she wrote this particular essay after 20 years. So the purpose, 5 points purpose also I have given. Therefore, I think you will be doing justice to this particular essay in your exam. Thank you.